The desert winds of New Mexico swept memories and secrets across a landscape both harsh and beautiful. In the small fading town of Whispering Rock, where every sunset told a story of pain and resilience, Thomas Red Elk, known to some as Tommy, sat alone by his rusted 1971 camper. The old vehicle, much like him, had survived decades of hardship. It was 1985, and even as he clutched a weathered newspaper clipping from 1945, he could still recall a day when his world shattered. Tommy's heart ached every time he looked at the photograph printed on that brittle newsprint. The image captured three little girls, innocent, scared, but somehow defiant, in crisp white dresses on the chapel steps of a boarding school named Saint Gertrude. Their names in that moment were mere labels given by strangers, Sarah, Naomi, and Eva, but those names were not what they had been given by their family. Before the boarding school stole every bit of their identity, they bore names steeped in the language and traditions of their people: Nazi, Alisi, and Ailin Joy, cherished symbols of their heritage and love. It was 1945, a time of war and profound sorrow. Tommy, only 18 back then, had been one of the few Indigenous boys forced into the system, separated from his sisters in a moment of brutal governmental indifference. Their father had been imprisoned for resisting the seizure of their ancestral lands, and their mother had died giving birth to Alan, a cruel twist of fate that left the siblings vulnerable to an assimilation process that was as ruthless as it was systematic. The boarding school, marketed as a stepping stone to America's bright future, had been nothing more than a prison where children were stripped of their heritage, silenced, and broken. Inside those cold, institutional walls, the children were separated by gender, with rigid routines designed not to nurture spirit, but to erase it. Tommy barely remembered the fleeting moments he had with his sisters, those stolen glimpses during the mandatory morning mass or the hurried evening devotions. Their hushed conversations in their native language were forbidden acts of rebellion, punishable by isolation in the dark, damp basement, and harsher beatings that left scars both seen and unseen. For Tommy, the disappearance of his sisters was not just a matter of time, it was a wound that refused to heal. One day, during a press visit meant to showcase the school's success, everything changed. Reporters had come, cameras clicking furiously, capturing the staged image of innocence and obedience. In the midst of it all, his three sisters had been singled out, their frightened eyes and gentle postures manipulated to fit a narrative of gratefulness. But the moment that followed, when their spots in the chapel remained empty during services, Tommy sensed that something was horribly wrong. Questions met with violent silence. They chased him away, pounding him for questioning, locking him up until the memory of his sisters was to be forgotten. Decades passed. Tommy roamed the vast, unforgiving landscapes of the Southwest in his battered camper, clinging to that yellowed newspaper clipping like a sacred relic. It wasn't only a memory, it was a promise. A promise that somewhere out there, his lost family lived. At 58, the man with hands marked by years of labor and loss had finally set up camp in Whispering Rock, a town that mirrored his own silent resignation. It was a place where even the wind seemed to whisper of yesterday's regrets. It was in this somber existence that Tommy's daily routine brought him to a small, local liquor store. The bell chimed above the door as he entered, and Marta Dane, a warm and gentle presence, greeted him. Marta, who had seen enough of sorrow to offer kindness without expecting praise, treated Tommy not as an angry, drunk Indian, but as a fellow human being with a story that deserved respect. When Tommy discovered he was short of cash to pay for his beer, Marta extended not only her sympathy, but also an invitation. "Come to church this Sunday with me," she said with a sparkle in her eye. "Maybe you'll find something there that goes beyond just a few bottles of beer." Tommy's immediate impulse was to refuse. He carried the bruises and bitterness of his past like armor, an armor built in the harsh crucible of a boarding school that had taken everything from him. But Marta's words, spoken with genuine concern, struck a chord deep within him. With a reluctant nod, he agreed, if only for the promise of 8 bottles of beer as a reward for enduring the service. That Sunday, the humble church of Holy Martyrs of the Desert Parish was filled with a quiet, steady light. As Tommy entered, his worn clothing and the faint scent of alcohol clung to him like a remnant of a past he could barely bear to remember. He slumped into a pew near the back, half dreading the familiar rituals of a faith imposed upon him years ago, yet curious about the message it might now bring. The service was simple, but for Tommy, every word of the hymns and prayers stirred a mixture of nostalgia and numbness. Father Murphy, the parish priest with kind eyes and gentle words, spoke of hope, redemption, and unseen miracles. Yet Tommy's attention was repeatedly drawn to a group of nuns standing quietly near the altar. They wore black habits and radiated an austere presence that unsettled him. Their eyes, however, hinted at a hidden empathy, a silent recognition of grief and loss that resonated deep within him. At one point during the service, Father Murphy mentioned the visit of the Handmaid Sisters of Saint DNA, a cloistered order known for their healing prayers and secretive ways. Curiosity sparked, Tommy hesitated, and then, almost on a dare, approached the prayer table. In trembling hands, he filled out a prayer request. The prayer he penned was simple, almost desperate, a plea for guidance about his missing sisters. At that moment, he made a half-jestful vow. If God could provide him with answers about his long-lost family, then he'd become a devoted follower of a faith he'd once scorned. After the service, as people trickled out, Tommy's gaze was caught by one of the nuns. Something about her, a small scar partially hidden by her habit, made his heart pound with an intensity he could hardly explain. In that fleeting moment, he recognized the mark from a story he'd heard as a child, the mark of bravery, of sacrifice, of protecting what was most precious. Unbeknownst to him, that nun would soon turn his life inside out. As Tommy left the church with Marta and Father Murphy bidding him farewell, the seeds of destiny had been sown. His journey, a journey through deserts of despair and mountains of mystery, was about to pick up momentum. Every step he took back to his camper was a step deeper into a painful past and a quest for the truth that had been buried under generations of indifference. In the quiet isolation of his mobile refuge, Tommy unfolded that fragile newspaper clipping once again. The image of his sisters, together in the light of an uncertain future, beckoned him onward. That photo was not just ink and paper. It was a doorway to the memories he had long feared to confront. It was his promise, to himself and to the family he had lost, that he would never stop searching. As the desert evening deepened and stars began to pierce the twilight, Tommy's heart whispered softly, someday, somehow, the silence would be broken. And in that break, a prayer answered, a family reunited, would come the healing that had eluded him for over 4 long decades.
The morning after the church service, Tommy woke with an unease he couldn't quite name. Sleep had come in scattered fragments, invaded by images of braided hair, candlelight, and whispered Navajo lullabies. For years, his dreams had brought his sisters to him, but always just out of reach. Yet last night felt different. Something had shifted. He sat at the edge of his camper's narrow bed, rubbing the prayer card he'd taken from the church between calloused fingers. The words were simple: ask and you shall receive. But to a man like Tommy, who had asked for 40 years and received nothing, they felt like a cruel joke. Still, he couldn't stop thinking about that nun. Her face was mostly hidden, her eyes low, but the scar on her cheek, faint, barely visible to the casual observer, had ignited something deep in his memory. It was Naomi who'd gotten that scar, he recalled, protecting their youngest sister from a sharp corner of a table during a punishment session at the boarding school. She'd never cried. Not then. Not even when the blood had stained the collar of her uniform. Naomi had always been the strongest of the three. Could it be? He tried to dismiss the thought. Time changes people. Decades alter voices, faces, eyes, and yet the sense of recognition clung to him like the desert dust. Later that morning, Marta Dane stopped by his camper with a warm thermos of coffee and a paper bag full of tamales. "You looked shaken yesterday," she said, sitting beside him on an overturned crate. "I didn't want you waking up alone with that much on your mind." Tommy thanked her, silently grateful for the kindness. After a few sips of coffee, he asked, "Do the handmaid sisters always come down from the mountain? I mean, is that normal?" Marta shook her head. "Not at all. They almost never leave the monastery. People drive hours just to leave prayer requests, and they rarely speak." That confirmed it for Tommy. He needed answers. Real ones. Not just the ones offered at a prayer table. That same afternoon, Tommy returned to the church. The sanctuary was quiet, lit only by the flickering red glow of the votive candles. He walked past the rows of pews and toward the side chapel where the nuns had stood during the service. No one was there now, just a heavy silence and the faint scent of incense clinging to the air. He turned to leave and froze. A voice, soft and trembling, spoke from behind him. "You were the man who submitted the prayer about missing sisters." Tommy turned slowly. A nun stood in the shadows of a stone pillar. She didn't lift her veil, but her posture was familiar, almost painfully so. "Yes," he said, "that was me." "You wrote about 3 girls," she said. "One with a singing voice, one who braided hair, one who drew pictures by candlelight." His throat tightened. "You read it?" The nun hesitated, then stepped into the light, and there it was, the scar, faint but unmistakable. "I didn't just read it," she whispered. "I lived it." Tommy's legs almost gave out beneath him. "Naomi?" he gasped. She looked away. "I haven't used that name in decades." "I never stopped looking," Tommy choked. "I thought you were dead. I thought all of you were." Tears spilled down her cheeks, streaking silently down the worn lines of her face. "I thought we'd never be found," she said. "But I saw you yesterday, and I knew. I knew my brother was still alive." They moved toward each other, slowly, as if afraid the moment would vanish. When they finally embraced, it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was quiet, trembling, and unbearably human. Tommy's arms held a sister he had only known as a girl. Naomi clung to a brother who had once shielded her from the wrath of cruel nuns and priests. "You were there the whole time," he whispered, grief and awe fighting in his voice. "I was trapped," she replied. "We all were." Back at the rectory, Father Murphy made a call. Not to the Vatican, not to any church superior, but to someone he trusted more. Joe Benally, a Navajo tribal police officer with a reputation for uncovering what others had buried. Tommy and Naomi waited in the small side room, neither speaking much. There was too much history, too much pain between them to wrap words around. Naomi's hands trembled as she removed her habit. Underneath the robe, bruises marred her skin, some fresh, others faded into yellow and green, signs of wounds that had never properly healed. Joe arrived within the hour. He was in his 40s, with deep eyes that saw more than people wanted him to. As soon as he entered the room, he nodded at Naomi respectfully, then turned to Tommy. "Let's talk," he said, "and I want you to be completely honest." Tommy told him everything, from the newspaper clipping to the scar he recognized, to Naomi's confirmation. Naomi added what she could. She didn't name names yet, not until she knew her other sisters were safe. But she gave Joe enough to begin. The location of the monastery compound, the rituals they were forced into, the manipulation of Navajo spirituality twisted alongside Catholic dogma. Joe's face was unreadable through most of it, but once Naomi lifted her sleeve and revealed the whip scars, his hands curled into fists. "We'll act tonight," he promised. "We'll need backup, but we won't wait. Not if others are still inside." That night, as the moon rose over the desert, the search began. Tribal officers, accompanied by state police and medics, made their way toward the mountain monastery. Tommy sat outside the church staring at the stars, his heart pounding with both hope and terror. "I thought you were dead," he repeated for the 3rd time. Naomi sat beside him, arms folded tightly around her body. We thought you forgot us. Never, he said fiercely. I kept this. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a creased drawing, a pencil sketch of Naomi braiding Eva's hair while Sarah sang nearby. I drew this by candlelight after you were taken. Naomi touched the paper with trembling fingers. You remembered us. I never had a choice, Tommy said. You were always with me, every single day. The sun hung low over the vast New Mexico desert, casting long shadows across the red earth and sagebrush. The fading light bathed the town of Whispering Rock in an orange glow, as if the earth itself was exhaling after another long, haunted day. Tommy stood outside the little church on the hill, still shaken by what had just happened. Inside the chapel, the air had felt too thick, too heavy, as though generations of silence and sorrow had clung to the walls like dust. He looked down at the small folded paper he had slipped into the prayer box earlier that morning. His handwriting was uneven, nearly shaking as he wrote the simple plea, Please God, if they're still alive, let me find them before I die. Tommy had spent the past 4 decades searching for his sisters. He had followed rumors, visited reservations in cities, questioned nuns and priests, and even traveled to Canada chasing the faintest trail. Each time his hope had risen, only to be crushed again. He had nothing left but the ache in his chest and a single pencil sketch he had drawn as a child of his 3 sisters, Naomi, Sarah, and Eva. But that morning at the church, he had seen something, a woman, just for a second. She had stepped out from a side corridor behind the altar, dressed in a black habit, her eyes lowered. But something in the curve of her cheek, the shape of her mouth, something in her silence. Tommy hadn't imagined it. His fingers still trembled as he remembered her eyes meeting his, just for an instant. Could it have been Naomi? Back at Clyde's small house in Whispering Rock, Tommy sat in a worn leather chair, staring blankly at the walls as Clyde made them some strong tea. The air between them was filled with unspoken questions. Clyde had known Tommy since their youth, knew the haunted look in his friend's eyes and the weight he carried. You saw her, didn't you? Clyde asked gently, placing a steaming mug in front of him. Tommy nodded slowly. I don't know. Maybe. But something felt wrong. Like she wanted to speak, but couldn't. Like she was screaming inside and no one could hear it. Clyde sat down across from him, his expression unreadable. You think she's still in that church? I think, Tommy whispered, she never left. There was silence between them for a long moment, broken only by the sound of the wind whispering through the chala outside. Finally, Clyde said, Then we go back tonight. Tommy blinked. What? You heard me. We go back. If your sister's still in there, we're not waiting another 40 years. Tommy hesitated. Part of him was terrified. Part of him was sure he was chasing ghosts. But a deeper part, the one that had carried him through every painful lead, every wrong turn, every dead end, leaned forward with burning resolve. All right, he said. We go after dark. The church was quiet when they returned, shrouded in shadows under a moonless sky. Clyde parked the truck a few hundred feet away, and the 2 men moved quietly toward the building. Tommy's heart pounded in his chest like a war drum. Inside, the chapel was lit only by a single flickering, votive candle. The scent of incense lingered in the air, though no mass had been held that day. Tommy's eyes scanned the dark corners, the pews, the side corridors. Nothing. Then a faint sound, a door creaking open. Both men turned toward the sacristy. Tommy stepped forward, slowly, quietly, and pushed the door open. The room beyond was sparse. A desk, an old wardrobe, shelves filled with dusty prayer books. But on the far wall was a narrow door, half hidden by a tapestry of the Virgin Mary. Tommy moved it aside, a staircase, leading down. He turned to Clyde, who gave him a grim nod. They descended together, each step creaking underfoot. The air grew colder, damper, the deeper they went. And then, light, flickering, candlelight. They emerged into an underground chamber, and there she was, Naomi. Her face was thinner now, older, her eyes shadowed with years of pain. But it was her. She was kneeling in front of a crude altar, a glass of communion wine shaking in her hand. A pale-faced priest stood behind her, chanting quietly in Latin. Two other women stood off to the side, also in black habits, their faces hidden beneath veils. Tommy's voice broke from his throat before he could stop it. "Naomi!" The priest turned in fury. "You are not welcome here." Clyde moved quickly, stepping between Tommy and the others. "Get your hands off her!" But the priest grabbed Naomi by the arm. "You do not understand. She's chosen. She speaks to the Virgin herself. She must not leave." Tommy surged forward, grabbing Naomi, pulling her to her feet. She stumbled, the wine spilling across the floor. Her eyes fluttered open, dazed, confused. "Tommy?" she whispered. "Is it really you?" Before he could answer, the door behind them burst open, and tribal police stormed in. Joe, the same officer who had spoken with them earlier, led the charge. "Hands where we can see them," he barked. The priest screamed curses in Latin as he was wrestled to the ground. His two assistants didn't resist. They stood still, hollow, empty-eyed, as if the spirit had long ago left their bodies. Joe looked at Tommy and Naomi. "We got your message. It's over." Naomi slumped into her brother's arms, sobbing. "It's not over," Tommy whispered. "Not until we find the others." Joe's face turned grim. "Then you'd better come with me. We have a lot more to uncover." The patrol car's red and blue lights cast haunting flashes across the broken stained glass windows of the old church. As Father Milford was forced into the back seat of the vehicle, he didn't resist. But his eyes, those cold, furious eyes, locked on Tommy. "You think your God saved her?" he hissed. "Your false ancestral spirits are powerless against the true faith. Your pagan filth has no place in the house of God." Before he could spew another word, the officer guiding him pressed his hand firmly against Milford's head and shoved him inside the cruiser, slamming the door behind him. The doors locked with a finality that echoed like justice, finally waking from a long, sorrowful slumber. Tommy stood frozen outside the church. His chest ached, not from exhaustion, but from the overwhelming weight of years. 40 years. 40 years of searching, grieving, praying into the void. And now, by what felt like a divine intersection of fate and faith, Naomi was alive. And she was in his arms again. The paramedics moved in quickly, treating Naomi with gentleness and urgency. Tommy stayed beside her the entire time, holding her hand, whispering soft words in Navajo that only they understood. She looked so fragile, like a reed barely standing against the wind. But her voice was steady. "I am no longer a nun," she told the emergency crew, her eyes meeting theirs with strength. "You can do whatever you need to. I give you permission." As the medical team began their evaluation, they carefully removed parts of Naomi's habit to access her wounds. Audible gasps rippled through the group. Her back, arms, and legs were lined with fresh lashes, some open and red, others already turning purple and blue. Years of beatings, it seemed, layered over one another like rings in an old tree trunk. "This is systemic," one paramedic whispered. "She's been living like this for years." Tommy's throat tightened, and he looked away, blinking back tears. Clyde, standing a few feet behind, was pale with horror. Joe, the tribal officer, returned from the underground chamber, his expression grim. "You need to hear what we found," he said. Tommy nodded and the three men stepped aside. Joe kept his voice low. "There's a small altar down there, a large statue of the Virgin Mary holding infant Jesus. Looks ordinary, except beside it is something stranger. A ceremonial rug, sage bundles, cornmeal offerings. Someone set up a Navajo ritual site next to a Catholic altar." Tommy blinked. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that man, Father Milford, he wasn't just abusing these women. He was experimenting, mixing belief systems, using sacred Navajo ceremonies and twisting them into some kind of hybrid worship." As if summoned by the very memory, Naomi's voice broke through their quiet circle. "He said we needed to drink the wine so our spirits would open, so we could receive visions from both the Virgin Mary and our ancestors." She had been listening. Naomi sat on a stretcher now, her IV dripping slowly into her arm. Her face was pale, her lips dry, but her voice held power. He believed that Native women, especially us, had closer ties to the spiritual world, that we were better conduits for divine communication. When we couldn't give him the answers he wanted, he punished us. Clyde clenched his jaw. This is monstrous. He desecrated both faiths. Naomi gave a bitter laugh. That man didn't believe in anything but control. The only women who were punished were indigenous. The white nuns were protected. We were made to kneel for hours, whisper prayers written by strangers, repeat them back as if they came from visions. The wine wasn't sacred. It was a drug to keep us compliant. Tommy stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. What about Sarah and Eva? Are they still in that place? Naomi's expression softened. Yes, but they've learned how to survive. They stopped resisting years ago. They fake visions now, pretend to channel messages. It's safer that way. Tommy's breath caught. So they're still alive? Yes, Naomi whispered, but barely. Joe spoke into his radio, coordinating with state authorities and federal partners to immediately begin a raid on the compound in the mountains, what had once been the cloistered monastery of St. Dolaroa. The same place Tommy had passed by months ago and thought looked more like a prison than a place of God. We'll get them out, Joe promised. Tonight. Tommy climbed into the ambulance beside Naomi, his hand never leaving hers. Clyde followed close behind in his truck as they made their way to the regional hospital. Sirens screaming into the night, piercing the silence of the desert like a cry of long-awaited justice. The waiting room at the regional medical center was painfully sterile. Plastic chairs, vending machines humming in the corner, the ever-present smell of antiseptic filling the air. Tommy sat, hunched forward, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Clyde sat beside him, occasionally glancing at the swinging doors of the emergency treatment area. I never stopped searching, Tommy whispered finally. Every day, even when it felt impossible. I know, Clyde said. I remember when I found you in those mountains, nearly dead, clutching that drawing. Even then, you still had fire in your eyes. Tommy smiled sadly. That sketch, that's all I had left of them. I used to imagine they could feel it, like it was a thread that might lead them back to me.